Scriptures. We pray these things in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, you might remember from last week, we're going through the second half of chapter 3 this morning. So last week we went through the first half of chapter 3. We had probably the most complicated, most difficult, most bizarre, toughest stuff in the whole chapter last week. I said the whole chapter, really the whole book last week. So much so that I had a hard time even figuring out exactly how to teach it last week, right? But this week we're going through the second half of chapter 3, something that is no less strange, no less difficult, but I think is a little bit easier to wrap our heads around. There are less dates, there are less tiny little details that you got to memorize. There's more of a story that we can follow as we look at the issue here in the second half of chapter 3. And the issue that we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk a little more about this in future weeks, but we're going to kind of dip our feet in today. The question we're going to talk about is why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Ever wondered about that? Why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Why these four Gospels? Why are these the Gospels that made it into the Bible? Why not other ones, right? Why not a different set of books? Why not more books? Actually, why do we have four, right? If you have one account of the life of Jesus, you'd think you'd have enough, right? Usually you read maybe one biography on somebody. You don't usually read four, right? Like if you read like a Thomas Jefferson biography or something like that, you're probably not going to be like, all right, time to go read another one, right? Why are there four biographies of Jesus in the Bible? And two, why are these four biographies the ones that make it in? This is what we're going to talk about today. Now, the reason that we're going to talk about it is because this has become a striking, kind of controversial issue in the last 20 or 30 years or so. You might have noticed this. Every Christmas, every Easter, what happens? One, a bunch of people come to church that you haven't seen since last Christmas and Easter, right? But two, Time Magazine, the New York Times, the Washington Post, everything, right? Every time you're standing in line at the grocery store, you look over at the magazine rack, and right around Christmas, right around Easter, what do you see? You see a bunch of cover stories about Jesus, right? And those cover stories almost always play something like, what do we really know about Jesus? Know what I'm talking about? They always say something like, the Bible has a lot of stories about Jesus, but what was Jesus really like, right? There's always this assumption that the Jesus in the Bible must be a wildly different character from the Jesus who actually existed, right? And so you open up that issue of Time Magazine, and you got a whole bunch of different stories, and there's almost always at least one story that basically boils down to this. It'll say, the four Gospels record the stories the church wants you to hear. But there are all these other Gospels filled with stories that the church doesn't want you to hear. Ever read something like that? Ever heard something like that? There's always some kind of magazine article every Christmas, every Easter, and it always boils down to the four Gospels are just the official story. The four Gospels are just the propaganda stories. They say the four Gospels are just the stories that the church wants you to believe. But if you go out and you dig around, you'll find all these other gospel stories about Jesus that the church doesn't want you to hear. And then they'll run through all of those, and they'll give them all a whole bunch of credence, right? There's always this assumption that the four Gospels in the Bible must be untrustworthy. But for some reason, all these other Gospels that are not in the Bible, right, they must be trustworthy, right? For whatever reason, we're really slow to believe the four Gospels. but we're really quick to believe all the other Gospels that didn't make it into the Bible. We're talking about why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, so that next Christmas, it's only a couple of months away, when those cover stories pop up, you'll be able to look at it and say, that's full of it. Right? So, let's talk about this. Where did this idea that the 4 Gospels in the Bible are just the propaganda stories come from? Where is the idea that the 4 Gospels in the Bible are just the stories that the church wants you to believe? Where did that idea come from? Do you remember from the chapter? This week it was only like 10 or 15 pages, so hopefully it's a little bit easier to remember. Do you remember what Lee Strobel says this week? It comes primarily from a group called the Jesus Seminar. Remember when they talked about the Jesus Seminar? They're going to talk more about the Jesus Seminar later in the book, but we're going to kind of dip our feet in now. I'm going to introduce you today. So the Jesus Seminar is a group of, I want to say scholars, but that's not entirely true. But for simplicity's sake, the Jesus Seminar is a group of mostly scholars who got together and they decided that they wanted to do kind of an in-depth project where they go in, look at the 4 Gospels, and they rate every single story about Jesus and every single word that Jesus is recorded as saying in the Gospels. They go in and they rate how likely they think it is that Jesus actually said it. They go in and they rate how likely it is that Jesus actually did it. Does that make sense? So the Jesus Seminar, it's a whole bunch of scholars and others. They get together in a big hotel conference room every year. They open up the book of Matthew. They go to the first thing that Jesus says, and they vote on whether they think Jesus really said it or not. They go to the book of Mark, and they go to the first thing Jesus says, and they vote on whether they think Jesus actually said it or not. Then they go to the book of Luke, and they vote on whether they think that Jesus actually said this, or that, or this, or that, or not. Then they go to the book of John, and they do the same thing. And so, case in point, the Lord's Prayer. Remember the Lord's Prayer, right? Jesus says, when you pray, don't babble like the idolaters do. When you pray, don't go and just pile phrases on top of each other trying to get God's attention. That's not how this works. He says, when you pray, be simple. Be direct. Be short. It's fine. You don't have to impress God. You don't have to show him all the big words you know. You don't have to pray in King James. Ever see that, right? Somebody gets up to say grace and they're like, our bountiful Father, thine love hast showered upon us. And you're like, dude, what are you doing? He says, when you pray like this. Our Father in heaven, your name is holy. Your kingdom come. Let your will be done here on earth like it is in heaven. Give us our daily bread today and every day, and deliver us from evil. Don't let us be taken in by temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom. Right? Yours is all power. Yours is all glory forever and ever. Amen. He says, be simple, be clear, be direct. Right? That's the Lord's Prayer. So the Jesus Seminar, just as a case in point, they go to the Lord's Prayer, and they take each line of the Lord's Prayer, and they have these beads. It's kind of weird. It looks like, I don't remember what the thing's called. Never. What's that old thing they used to use as a calculator?
I know what you're talking about, where you slide the beads across.
I should have looked up the word so I could know it for this. But yeah, it looks like one of those. But they have red beads, pink beads, purple beads, blue beads, and black beads. And so they go, Our Father, and they vote using the beads. And they go, Who art in heaven? And then they vote using the beads. Your kingdom come, right? They vote using the beads. Your will be done. They vote using the beads. All of that, right? The red beads mean, I am confident that Jesus actually said this. The pink beads say, Jesus probably said this or something like it. The purple beads mean, Jesus might have said this. The blue beads mean, Jesus didn't say this, but he probably said something sort of similar. And the black beads mean, Jesus did not say this. And so they go in to the Lord's Prayer and they vote using the beads. By the end, the only words of the Lord's Prayer that the Jesus Seminar people were confident Jesus actually said were, Our Father. That's it. The Jesus Seminar put out a press release and they said, the Lord's Prayer is fabricated. All Jesus said was, Our Father. The rest of it was made up. That's the thing. The Jesus Seminar was really media savvy. They were really good at doing press conferences. They were really good at feeding stories to journalists to kind of puff up sort of what they were doing. And so by the end of that, they've gone through all 4 of the Gospels, and they come out with this press release where they say, panel of experts, the Jesus Seminar, concludes that Jesus only said 20% of what the Gospels quote him as saying. That's what the Jesus Seminar came out with. They said Jesus probably only said about 20% of what the Gospels quote him as saying. Now beyond that, right, this is the shallow end, because beyond this they go a little bit further. That's just the kind of the appetizer, right? The main course is coming up, because after they come out with that first kind of bombshell press release, the Jesus Seminar takes it a step further, and they say the 4 Gospels probably aren't very good accounts of the life of Jesus. They say the Gospels aren't trustworthy accounts of the life of Jesus. Obviously, they must not be if only 20% of what they say is actually true, right? So they said the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are not trustworthy biographies of Jesus. But then they say there is one that's trustworthy. The scholars and others that gather at the Jesus Seminar say there is one biography of Jesus that we do think is trustworthy, but it's not in the Bible. They say the only trustworthy biography of Jesus is a book that was rejected from the Bible called the Gospel of Thomas. Ever heard of the Gospel of Thomas? Well, if you read the chapter, you have. But before that, ever heard of the Gospel of Thomas? It's one of the more well-known alternative Gospels. It's one of the more kind of popular, kind of well-known. Most people have heard of it either because they've seen the Da Vinci Code or because they've read one of those Time magazine articles, something like that. But the Jesus Seminar comes out and says only 20% of what the 4 Gospels in the Bible say actually happened, but the Gospel of Thomas, we think this one's trustworthy. They say, we think the Gospel of Thomas is an earlier gospel, probably written right after the death of Jesus, and that it probably records what Jesus says more accurately than any of the 4 Gospels. That's what they say. And so they start putting out books, because that's how this goes, right? They start putting out books called, like, the Fifth Gospel, the Gospel of Thomas. They start printing out Bibles that include the Gospel of Thomas before Matthew. They start putting out all these books about how they think the Gospel of Thomas was written. And they say the Gospel of Thomas, this one, this is the book you need to read if you want to get the real Jesus. So, the Jesus Seminar kicks off a craze starting about 30, really about 40 years ago, back in the 80s. It's crazy to think the 80s was 40 years ago, right? But the Jesus Seminar kicks off this craze for alternative gospels. The Jesus Seminar kicks off this fad where suddenly all these books, all these articles, all these documentaries are being made about the secret gospels that the church doesn't want you to know about. You heard anything like that? Ever seen a History Channel documentary? Ever watched like an ABC News special? Something like that, right? There's this craze, this fad that starts about 40 years ago. Everybody's looking for secret gospels that the church doesn't want you to know about. The most obvious example is the Da Vinci Code. Ever seen or read the Da Vinci Code? It's a good movie. It basically feels like an Indiana Jones movie, but it's about the Vatican, right? It's like Indiana Jones versus the Vatican. It's Indiana Jones versus the Catholic Church. It's very silly, but it's a good movie. So, if it's on TV sometime, watch it. But the most obvious example of this is the Da Vinci Code. The Da Vinci Code basically boils down to this detective, scholar, anthropologist guy named Robert Langdon gets hired by the Catholic Church. He gets hired by I don't even remember. He gets hired by somebody to investigate the death of this other guy who's also kind of a scholar in the field of like New Testament studies and stuff like that. This guy gets killed and Robert Langdon gets hired to investigate. So he starts investigating, and to make a long story short, as he's investigating the death of this guy, he finds out that the Catholic Church has been lying about everything for 2,000 years, that Jesus actually had a wife and some kids, and that the bloodline of Jesus has continued all through history and all this stuff, and now there's a group of renegade priests who are trying to kill all the living descendants of Jesus. Pretty wild, right? Very blasphemous, but pretty wild, So that's the plot of the Da Vinci Code. And as the movie progresses, it's like every new scene, they find out some new thing. And so they meet up with Ian McKellen, the actor who plays Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings movies and Magneto in the X-Men movies. They meet up with Ian McKellen, and Ian McKellen's like, what you don't know is that the church collected all these different stories about Jesus, and they found all the ones they liked, and they burned all the ones they didn't like. And so the 4 Gospels, those are the stories they liked. But all these other Gospels, these are the ones they didn't like. So they burned them, and they killed everybody who had them, and they threw everybody in jail who knew about them, to make it a secret, to hide the fact that Jesus had a wife, to hide the fact that Jesus had kids, to hide the fact that Jesus was just a man, to hide all these different things the church doesn't want you to know. The Da Vinci Code, in other words, is like the action-adventure movie version of the claims that the Jesus Seminar was making. It's like this is the kind of scholarly, complex version, and this is the simple TV show version. And so about 40 years ago, we initiated a craze for finding secret gospels. We began this craze for finding alternative gospels. And specifically, at the heart of that craze was this notion that if we can find the secret gospels, if we can find the alternative gospels, if we can find the non-biblical gospels, then we can find the truth about Jesus. If we can find the secret gospels, we can find the real story of Jesus that the church doesn't want us to know. That's the craze that began about 40 years ago, and that's one of the things that you hear a lot if you talk to a lot of skeptics. They'll say, you don't really know anything about Jesus because all you have is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they'll say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is just propaganda. They say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is just the stories the church wants you to believe. But the real stories about Jesus, you can only find those in the secret gospels. You can only find those in the non-biblical gospels. So, ever heard anything like that? Ever seen a History Channel special? Anything like that? Ever seen one of those viral posts on Facebook? If you're friends with a lot of skeptics, some people are just like not Christians and they just don't care. But some people are like not Christians and they want you to know about it, right? Some people are like, hey, you! I'm not a Christian! You're like, okay. I'm going to go back to what I'm doing. And they're like, stop! Notice me! I'm not a Christian! I don't believe in God! And you're like, okay. I'm going to keep mowing my lawn now. Go back inside your house. Some people have kind of that personality, so that they'll spread things like this, all over Facebook and stuff like that. So maybe you've seen something like this before on the internet, on social media, on TV, in a Time magazine article. But this is a very common thing that you are going to hear if you do a lot of talking with skeptics. You're going to hear that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are just propaganda books that the church wants you to believe, but that the truth about Jesus has been hidden, and that you can only really find it by looking at the secret Gospels. Books like the Gospel of Thomas, books like the Gospel of Mary, books like the Gospel of Philip, or the Gospel of Peter, or the Infancy Gospel. Lee Strobel talks about some of those books in the chapter.
Is there really a book about those?
So here's the thing. There is a book called the Gospel of Thomas. There is a book called the Gospel of Peter. There is a book called the Gospel of Mary. There is a book called the Infancy Gospel. We're going to talk about all of those in the, unfortunately, only 30 minutes we have left. But here's the thing we're going to find. All of those books are full of it. Let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about the difference between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John on the one hand, and the so-called secret Gospels on the other hand. So, the secret Gospels that the Da Vinci Code keeps talking up, the secret Gospels that the Jesus Seminar keeps talking up, to make a long story very short, they are not trustworthy. You would have to be really, really dumb to think they were. Here's why. First things first, the secret Gospels that the Da Vinci Code and the Jesus Seminar are obsessed with are exactly that. Secret. So the opening line of the Gospel of Thomas says this: these are the secret words of Jesus, which he dictated to Didymus Thomas. These are the secret words of Jesus, which he dictated to Thomas. And then after that, there's 114 lines of just dialogue from Jesus. Now, some of those lines of dialogue are basically identical to stuff that you would find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Like at one point in the Gospel of Thomas, it records Jesus saying, a city on a hill cannot be hidden. That sounds a lot like something in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, right? So some of the stuff in the Gospel of Thomas is perfectly normal. But then some of the stuff in the Gospel of Thomas is meaningless. Some of the stuff in the Gospel of Thomas is literally just gobbledygook, right? It's nonsense. So like at one point in the Gospel of Thomas, it quotes Jesus as saying, "Split wood, and I am there. Lift up a rock, and I am there." That sounds like the kind of thing you would say like right after you hit your blunt, right? That's like something a pothead would say, right? That's the kind of thing that a 14-year-old on the internet would think is deep, right? So it's a nonsense sentence. But then other stuff gets even weirder. So the most famous line in the Gospel of Thomas is right near the end. It says, Peter came up to Jesus and said, "Jesus, cast out Mary Magdalene, because she's a woman, and women are not worthy of life." So sexist Peter over here, right? And then Jesus responds saying, "No, I will not cast her out." So far, so good, right? Is the Gospel of Thomas Jesus going to turn out to be like the feminist hero we've been waiting for? No, he is not. Because after that, he says, "I will not cast Mary out, because I will take her and I will make her into a man, so that she will become a living spirit who can inherit eternal life." Peter says, "Cast out Mary because she's a woman." And Jesus says, "Don't worry, man. I'm going to make her into a man." Jesus about to perform the world's first sex change operation? Probably not. All of this makes perfect sense when you know that the Gospel of Thomas was written by a 2nd century cult that believed two things. The 2nd century cult that wrote the Gospel of Thomas believed, one, that women suck. They were a misogynist cult. They were a sexist cult. They literally believed that women aren't human. They believed that women can't go to heaven. They believed that women can't be free to make their own decisions. They believed that women need to be kept locked up in the kitchen, right, with their feet bound, just kind of churning out babies, right? That's what this 2nd century cult that wrote the Gospel of Thomas believed. They believed that women aren't human, one. And two, they believed that the God who saves people somehow is everything. Have you ever heard of pantheism? It's a religion. A lot of millennials are pantheists. They believe that the universe is God. Right? They believe that God is everything. Right? So you're God. I'm God. This church here is God. Right? You go outside, look at the grass. The grass is God. The trees are part of God. Right? The clouds are part of God. The animals outside are part of God. That's called pantheism. If you believe that God and the world are actually the same thing, that's pantheism. This is a pantheistic cult that also hates women. Very weird, right? If you meet a pantheist today, they're probably a hippie, right? But back in the day, these pantheists, they hated women. So the Gospel of Thomas is written by a 2nd century cult that worshipped all of creation and hated women. So when you get this 2nd century cult who hates women and worships creation, you get things like the story of how Jesus is going to turn Mary into a man so that she can have eternal life. And you get weird nonsense sayings like split wood, and I am there, right? Lift up a rock, and I am there. If God is everything, right, then he's there when you lift up the rock, right? If God is everything, he's there when you split wood. And so you have this pantheistic, misogynistic cult, and they wrote the Gospel of Thomas because the real Gospels don't fit their beliefs. So they wrote their own. That's one of the things that you find as you look through these so-called secret Gospels. Almost every single one of them was written by a 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century cult that broke off from the church and started their own thing. They broke off from the church and they started their own group. They broke off from the church and they started their own false religion. They started having their own little cult church services. But if you're having your own little cult church services, you need something to read during the cult church service, right? You need something to preach from during the cult service. But Matthew's not going to work because Matthew teaches the truth, right? And so if you broke off from the church to start a cult, Matthew's not going to work for you, right? If you broke off from the church to start a cult with false beliefs, Mark isn't going to work for you. If you broke off from the church to start a cult with false doctrine, Luke isn't going to work for you. If you break off from the church to start a cult with false theology, John is not going to work for you. These 4 Gospels aren't going to work because you're constantly going to be preaching against what they say, not with what they say, right? That means you got to do what? You got to write your own darn gospel. You got to write your own gospel where you put your own words into the mouth of Jesus. You've got to write your own gospel where you put your own ideas into the mouth of Jesus. And that is exactly what happens with the Gospel of Thomas. There was a pantheistic cult who hated women, so they write a gospel where Jesus is pantheistic and where Jesus hates women. That's what the Gospel of Thomas is. And the fact that the scholars at the Jesus Seminar were dumb enough to fall for it says some really sketchy things about the credibility, right? But that's just the Gospel of Thomas. Look at the Da Vinci Code, and they quote all kinds of other Gospels. They don't just quote the Gospel of Thomas. They also quote the Infancy Gospel. Have you ever heard of the Infancy Gospel? This was my favorite one. The Infancy Gospel is a gospel account. It was written by a different cult in the 2nd or 3rd century, and this one's wild. This one makes the Gospel of Thomas look like nothing. So this is called the Infancy Gospel, or the full name is the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, but it has nothing to do with the other Gospel of Thomas, so don't get them confused. So I just call it the Infancy Gospel to avoid confusion. In the Infancy Gospel, it records, or it claims to record the childhood of Jesus. You'll notice in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we get almost no information about Jesus' childhood, right? We get that one story where Jesus gets lost in the temple, right? But that's it. That's all we get about the childhood of Jesus in the 4 Gospels. And so the Infancy Gospel claims to tell the story of the childhood of Jesus. But the stories they tell are insane. So, you ever seen the movie The Omen? It's about the Antichrist. Gregory Peck accidentally adopts the Antichrist. And so the little kid he adopts, kills his nanny, and then, kills the local priest, and then, kills all these people. Everybody who crosses him or makes him mad or anything, lightning will strike and they'll blow up. Or anybody who crosses him or something like that, dogs will attack them when they're alone and they'll get eaten. So Damien, the little Antichrist that Gregory Peck accidentally adopts, he just, everywhere he goes, people are just dying. Everywhere he goes, bad things are happening to people. People are experiencing these horrific deaths, and it's because he's using his little Antichrist powers to like zap people every time they cross it, right? It's a funny movie. But the Infancy Gospel of Thomas portrays little kid Jesus basically the way the Omen portrays the tiny little Antichrist. So like, case in point, when Jesus is a little kid, the Infancy Gospel says a kid is running through the streets and he smacks into Jesus on accident and he doesn't say, "Excuse me." And so Jesus turns and just like, "Die." And the kid just like, his heart stops and he just dies. And then later when Jesus is a little bit older, when he's at the synagogue being trained in the synagogue like all Jewish teenagers would have been, little teenage Jesus is sitting in synagogue class and the rabbi is teaching through the Old Testament, and he's rude to Jesus. I don't remember what it is. Like, Jesus asks if he can go to the bathroom, and the rabbi's like, "No." And he's like, "Then die!" And so the rabbi's heart stops, and he just like falls over and dies. Like, Jesus is just killing people left and right. That's the Infancy Gospel. That's one of these secret Gospels that the Jesus Seminar and the Da Vinci Code is saying, you got to read this if you want to know the truth about Jesus. But here's the problem. Just like the Gospel of Thomas, the Infancy Gospel was written by a cult that broke off from the church in the early centuries after Jesus. And this particular cult, I love this one, this particular cult was obsessed with stories about God killing people. This cult was obsessed with stories about God killing people. Now, I know you know a lot of Southern Baptists who are obsessed with stories about God killing people too, but I mean, this whole cult was, right? So every time they'd get together, they would talk about like that story with Elisha the prophet, where there's all these kids like making fun of him, and so he calls down a bunch of bears, and the bears all come and just eat all the kids, right? Like, they were obsessed with that story. Or they were obsessed with the story of Ananias and Sapphira, right? Where Ananias and Sapphira, they try to rob the church, and so they both just die right there on the spot. They were obsessed with the story of God striking down Onan. Remember Genesis like 38, 28? I can't remember which chapter it is. Onan is supposed to take Tamar to be his wife. He's supposed to provide her with children, and he's supposed to take care of her for the rest of his life. But Onan refuses, and so God just kills him, right? Now, these things are rare throughout the Bible, right? We remember the violent stuff from the Bible because that's just how we're wired. We remember violent, shocking, scary stuff, but you read through the whole Bible, there's actually very little of that. And yet that's the stuff we remember. And that's the stuff this cult was obsessed with. They were obsessed with stories about God killing people, and they were trying to channel that God people so they could kill people, right? They would like go out and they'd be like, "Die!" And then nothing would happen. And they'd be like, I guess I got to pray more. And they'd go back. But so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John don't work for you if you're that cult that's obsessed with God killing people, do they? Because Jesus is presented almost as a pacifist in the four Gospels in the Bible. And so if you're a cult obsessed with God killing people, these do not work. So what do you got to do? You got to write your own gospel. And so the Infancy Gospel was born. We can do this all day. Same thing is true with a book called the Gospel of Judas. Same thing is true with a book called the Gospel of Mary. Same thing is true with a book called the Gospel of Philip. We could go all kinds of weird, lurid stories, but we don't have enough time to go through them all. The important thing to remember is that the secret Gospels, you can trace pretty much every single one of them to a 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or 5th century cult that broke away from the church. And so these are not secret books that the church doesn't want you to know about. These are secret books that were written way long after any of this stuff happened, way long after Jesus, that the church didn't have to suppress, they just ignored. Right? That's the first thing. These secret gospels, they root back to 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century cults. That's why they're not in the Bible. But even more than that, and I actually went to talk about this first, but I accidentally veered off into the second point. The secret gospels all present themselves as secret. So, remember what I said about Thomas? The opening lines of the Gospel of Thomas says, these are the secret words of Jesus spoken to Didymus Thomas, which he then wrote down. The Gospel of Judas has Jesus pulling Judas aside and says, I have these secret words that I'm going to tell you and nobody else. Same thing happens with pretty much all the other so-called secret gospels. Every single one of them open basically the same way. The writer says, these are the secret words of Jesus that he secretly told to me and nobody else in a secret location that nobody else was allowed to know about. That's what the secret gospels present themselves as. They say these are the secret teachings of Jesus, that Jesus secretly told to a secret group of secret followers that I wrote down. These are the secret words of Jesus that he only told to me. Now, can anybody tell me what's wrong with that? I can tell you what's wrong with that. If you come to me with a book and you say, these are the secret words of Jesus that he only told to me, then I just have to take your word for it. Right? If you come to me with a book and you say, these are the secret teachings of Jesus that he only told to me, I just have to take your word for it. If you say, Jesus secretly taught this to me, but he didn't tell anybody else because nobody else was worthy. He only told me. That's why nobody else has ever said any of this before. These are the secret teachings of Jesus that he only told to me, so you just have to take my word for it. How reliable do you think that's going to be? It'd be kind of like if somebody came to your door, okay, and said, Kay, I have bad news for you. Your husband's been having an affair with me. He says he's going to leave you. But I'm kind of strapped for cash, so I'll make you a deal. You give me $1,000 in cash right now, and I'll cut off all communication with him, and I'll never talk to him again. Are you going to believe them? No, right? Because you know JB, right? You've known JB for pretty much your whole life. You know the kind of person JB is, right? You've seen JB in action, right? You are familiar with JB. You know JB's character. You know his faithfulness. You know his committedness to the covenant that he made to you. You've seen JB for all these years, and that's just not the kind of thing that JB would do. And so you're probably going to ask some questions like, real quick, what is my husband's name? And if they fumble around and they don't actually know your husband's name, what are you going to conclude? This is probably a con artist, right? This is probably somebody who goes to a bunch of different houses over the course of a day and says, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your spouse has been having an affair with me, but if you give me $1,000, I'll go away forever, right? If you knock on the right doors, eventually you'll hit somebody who's like, okay, I'll give you the $1,000, just get out of our lives, right? They're going to be so flustered, they're not going to ask the questions, right? They're not going to ask, what is my husband's name? They're not going to ask, okay, well, what day and times did you meet with my husband, right? They're not going to ask the kind of questions that would poke holes in their story, right? They're going to be insecure. They're going to be easily fooled, and so they're going to give $1,000, and they're going to now think their spouse has been cheating on them because this person just came and just knocked on a bunch of doors and said the same thing to all of them, right? But you know JB. You have the testimony of 50 plus years of knowing JB. And so you're not going to believe what this person says when they say, listen, your husband is having an affair with me. You're just going to have to take my word for it and give me $1,000, right? The secret gospels are basically exactly like that. Because the secret gospels are somebody coming up to your door, knocking on it and saying, hey, I have these secret teachings of Jesus, but he only told them to me. And so you just have to take my word for it. That's what every one of these secret gospels says. They say, we have these secret teachings of Jesus, but he only told them to me. And so the Gospel of Mary says Jesus was secretly married to Mary Magdalene, but he only told me about it. So you just have to take my word for it. The Gospel of Judas says that Jesus and Judas were actually secretly best friends and that they plotted the crucifixion together, but he only told me. So you just have to take my word for it. The Gospel of Philip says that Mary actually had sex with a Roman soldier, and that's who Jesus' dad was, not God. But he only told me. So you just have to take my word for it, right? The Gospel of Thomas says Jesus hated women, but he only told me. So you just have to take my word for it. How trustworthy is that? It's not trustworthy at all. It's exactly the same as that dude who shows up to Kay Hunt's house and says, Kay, I have bad news for you. Your husband's having an affair with me, but give me $1,000 and I'll go away. The Gospel of Thomas is counting on you being a rube. The Infancy Gospel is counting on you being an idiot. The Gospel of Mary is counting on you being stupid. The Gospel of Philip is counting on you being gullible. We could do this all day long. These were late documents written in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century by cults that broke away from the church and then wrote their own gospels and hid that fact by saying, these are the secret words of Jesus that he only told to me. So you just have to take my word for it. So once again, what are you going to put more stock in? The so-called secret gospels that say, here's the secret teachings of Jesus that he only told to me, so you're going to have to take my word for it, or the 4 biblical gospels that were written by 1, Matthew, literally the disciple of Jesus. 2, John, once again, literally a disciple of Jesus. Mark, an associate of Peter who interviewed Peter and then went around the empire interviewing townspeople who met Jesus. Luke, an associate of Paul, who traveled around the empire, went around the promised land, went to every town that Jesus went to, interviewed the people who saw him, who met him, who talked to him, who interviewed Mary. That's probably why the Mary section of the Gospel of Luke is so detailed, right? Matthew probably interviewed Joseph. That's why the Joseph section of Matthew is so detailed, right? You have these 4 Gospels written by people who did basically the work of a journalist, who went around interviewing eyewitnesses of Jesus all throughout the Promised Land and then putting their Gospels together based on those eyewitness accounts. And so everything in Matthew, everything in Mark, everything in Luke, everything in John, this is all public knowledge, right? Everything in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's like if there was an explosion downtown Lewisburg, right? Imagine that downtown Lewisburg today, something exploded. And imagine that I went down there with my phone, right? And I turned on the recording app, and I went and I said, who all was here during the explosion? And I found all the people who were there who watched the explosion. And I said, tell me everything you remember about what happened. And then they tell me, right? Then I go to this person and I say, tell me everything you remember about what happened. And then I go to this person over here and I say, tell me everything you remember about what happened, right? And then I take all those stories and I transcribe them out and I write it out into a whole narrative of the explosion downtown, and then I present it to you, right? That's what the four Gospels are. They go through each of the towns that Jesus walked through, and they say, tell me everything you remember. And then they write it down. That's what the four Gospels. That's what the four Gospels are. But the Gospel of Thomas, the Infancy Gospel, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Peter, obviously none of these were written by the people they were named after. Thomas did not write the Gospel of Thomas, right? Thomas had been dead for like 150 years when the Gospel of Thomas was written, right? Judas did not write the Gospel of Judas. Judas was ultra dead when the Gospel of Judas was written, right? Same thing with the Gospel of Mary. Mary had nothing to do with it. They just named it after these people to try to give it an air of authority. But you get to the Gospel of Thomas, you get to the Infancy Gospel, you get to the Gospel of Judas, you get to the Gospel of Mary, and these are all not eyewitness documents based on interviews with people who met Jesus. These are all claims that we have the secret teachings of Jesus, but he only told them to me. Let me ask you, which of these two things sounds more credible to you? The eyewitness accounts, or the, hey, listen to this secret teaching of Jesus that he only told me, so you have to take my word for it? The eyewitness accounts, right? Yeah. So that's really what's at stake here. Every Christmas, every Easter, Time magazine puts out a whole bunch of articles that say if you want the truth about Jesus, you have to go to the Gospels the church doesn't want you to know about. But they're talking about the Gospel of Thomas. They're talking about the Infancy Gospel. They're talking about the Gospel of Mary. They're talking about the Gospel of Philip. But Thomas, Infancy, Mary, Philip, all of these are cult Gospels written hundreds of years later by people who said, here are the secret teachings of Jesus that he only told to me. You think you need to read these to know about the real Jesus? No. You need to read the 4 books that were written based on eyewitness accounts of Jesus. If you want the real Jesus, you'll find him in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's all we have time for today. I was going to talk a little more about specifically how we got the 4, but maybe we'll hit that next week or in a later week. Are there any questions real quick before I close out? I won't be able to answer it quite as in-depth as usual, but are there any questions? Okay.
It was all interesting.
It was, yes.
Yeah. Very repetitive, once again, but as always, I wanted to hammer it into your head. If you have any more questions about all this, you can ask next week as well, because we should have more time next week, I think.
So it would be in chapter 4 next week?
We should be in chapter 4, yeah.
4, okay.
I need to reread chapter 4 to remember what it covers.
I read most of it, but then I thought.
Well, aren't you gonna finish up what you put up there today for next week?
Yeah, I might cram it into, I might work it into 4. So, depending on what the content of chapter 4 is, it might fit in with the rest there. But yeah, no, I'll get into that, don't worry.
Why don't you leave that in? It's interesting, okay?
Fair enough, yeah. We can talk about this all day. Like, I can literally, I have enough notes here. Like, I wrote out enough yesterday that we could literally, like, talk about it for 3 or 4 hours if we wanted to. But we have 1 hour.
Sit right here and listen to it.
There you go. Yeah, but we'll jump back in on a little bit of that next week. We'll cover it a little bit more.
Okay.
Yeah, that was unfortunately just kind of that was the shallow end. That's like the SparkNotes version. Oh, well, so SparkNotes is after your time. So SparkNotes is like a website that summarizes like all the English books that you have to read at school. And so back when I was in 9th and 10th grade, I used a ton of SparkNotes because I became a Christian at the very end of 10th grade. Before that, I cheated through everything. Like, I cheated my way from like 6th grade to 10th grade. And so I was like a C student. And then when I became a Christian and I stopped cheating, I became like an A-B student. So I would have gotten better grades if I had just done my homework. But hey. Yeah, so that was the SparkNotes version of that. There's a whole lot we could talk about.